Welcome to Nobody Told Me. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens.
It is a pleasure to welcome back our guest on this episode, time management expert Laura Vanderkam. Laura is the best-selling author of several books, including What the Most Successful People Do Before Breakfast, Off the Clock, Feel Less Busy While Getting More Done, and her latest book, Juliet's School of Possibilities, a little story about the power of priorities.
Laura, thank you so much for joining us again. We're so excited to have you back with us.
Thank you so much for having me back. I appreciate it.
Well, first of all, Laura, I have to say that I absolutely love the book, Juliet's School of Possibilities. And maybe part of it is that I resonated so much with the main character, Riley, because she's basically me. She's in her late 20s, and she's trying to figure out how to manage her time and really how to have it all. And I'm wondering, what inspired the book?
Yeah, so Riley, the main character, is late 20s, ambitious. Her life is falling apart, though, and, she's always been the best at everything, working harder than anyone else, and because she's so smart at work, but as she's promoted into management, she is suddenly learning that you can't just do everything. You have to choose which of the things that are coming at you you need to focus on. And she's having a really hard time making that choice. She just does whatever is flashing most brightly in front of her. And as a result, Riley is losing her personal life. Her boyfriend and her friends lose patience with her. And then her firm winds up giving her an ultimatum, too, because she's not succeeding professionally either. They give her 30 days or she's out.
So who is Riley based on? Is it based a little bit on you, on your friends? Who?
Well, I joke that I've never really had a rock bottom moment like that. Thank goodness. My life is just not that interesting. But, I see so many people in the course of writing about time management who really feel like they're constantly falling behind. And it's not because they're lazy people. It's not because they're watching too much TV or something. I mean, they're doing all the things that they think they're supposed to do. The problem is that, as we talk later in the book, is that expectations are infinite. I mean, there's no way you could do everything that everybody wants you to do. So at some point, you have to make a choice. Every, decision to do one thing is a decision not to do something else. And, Riley has not been actively making those choices, so she needs to go to Juliet's School of Possibilities in order to learn.
I want to talk about that lesson you just mentioned. Expectations are infinite. Time is finite. You are always choose well. So what guidelines should we use to make sure we're making the right choices?
Well, I think it's helpful to have a vision of what is important in your life. And one of the things that Riley does at this place, this mysterious Juliet School of Possibilities, is see potential futures for herself. And one is much better than another. But the really good one, it's bringing everything together. She's satisfied professionally and personally. And I think it's really helpful for people to have that sort of image. Like if all the threads of your life, the things that make you happiest and most energized, if you were firing on all cylinders, what would you be doing? Like, what would be filling your hours? What would your life look like? And I'm not saying that will, exactly come to pass because, we never can predict life entirely. And, who knows? I mean, maybe you'd be perfectly fulfilled doing some sort of technology that doesn't even exist right now in 20 years. So we can't exactly prepare for that. But, having enough of these images in your brain allows you to then make choices and say, well, is my choice to do X getting me closer to that image, or is it not? Would I be better off spending that quantity of time doing Y? And nobody's ever going to make perfect choices all the time, but if we keep making choices that nudge us a little bit closer to that vision, then over time we can build the lives we want.
Laura, your other books about time management have been nonfiction. Why did you decide to do one that is fiction?
Well, I've learned over the years that people really like stories. I give dozens of speeches every year, and nobody really comes up to me afterwards and says, yeah, that one statistic you had, that was great, things like that. It's always that story you told about this, like that, I really resonated with me. And so, you learn these things and see this. And so I decided, well, let me try to turn my time management advice into a story. So Juliet came from that.
And one of the most personally relatable things that I feel Riley does is to try to respond to emails instantly. And in my life, I always try and do that first thing in the morning when I wake up. But I feel like some emails end up taking longer to respond to than others, so I end up behind for the rest of my day, and that just starts off this cycle that isn't the best and leads to me feeling overwhelmed. Why do people like me so grossly underestimate the amount of time that basic tasks are going to take?
Well, I think the problem with email, and this is certainly the case in the book as well, is that it expands to fill all available space. So we always have these ideas of like, oh, I can be on top of my email. Maybe if I just try a little harder or start a little earlier, I'll be on top of my email. But the truth is you can really never be fully on top of your email, because whatever you do to get yourself on top of your email, to get down to inbox zero, is going to then result in people emailing you back, right? And then you're not at inbox zero anymore. So the truth is you can never fully be on top of it. All you can decide is how much time you are willing to devote to it. And so I encourage people to see that this is actually a choice. You can decide that I'm not going to spend all day responding to messages. I'm going to decide to check it a couple times, and it can be frequent times. You know, I'm not saying you don't need to check every hour, every 2 hours, but there's a big difference between checking every hour, every 2 hours versus checking every 5 minutes, which is about what a lot of people do. And then they get sucked into it. You know, one thing takes a long time to respond, and then it's time to like check again because you've been in your inbox for 30 minutes responding to this email. And so you wind up never doing anything else. And, that's fine to send careful, well thought through messages. Those can be very important, but I think we need to acknowledge those as being important and choose to spend time on them, and then maybe not get quite so excited about responding to absolutely everything else in a short period of time.
So how do you manage your email throughout the day?
Well, so I try to check a couple times a day, but I do know that I tend to get more I wind up checking email more frequently as the day goes on. I mean, partly it's because people are responding about things. And it's also just that my attention span is kind of falling apart by the end of the day. So I really try to carve out the morning for my most intense focused work. If I can try to be focused on writing projects, for instance, from, say, 8:30 to 10:30, then it doesn't really matter as much if I'm in and out of my inbox much of the rest of the day, because I've already spent 2 hours, working on whatever is most important for me to be doing that day.
Is it your sense that emails and texting are taking up more time, or are they freeing up more time than people had, say, 30 years ago?
I think it's a mix. And I'm glad to hear you phrase the question that way, because a lot of times people are just like, well, email and text are evil. How can we get
right?
Well,
you do hear that.
They're not evil. I mean, it's how your kid, gets you to come pick them up at the soccer field. It's a quick way to say I love you during the day. And email, is amazing. Like, I worked as a journalist many years ago, and I learned to report before we had email. And it was just ridiculous, like calling people all day and hoping they would call back. And then they call back as soon as you're on the phone with someone else, inevitably.
Yeah.
So it's, they're really amazing tools. And I think they do, have much to do to allow time to kind of open up for certain things. That said, they are tools. They are not our jobs themselves. They are tools to do our jobs, and they need to be treated as such.
We thank you so much for joining us on Nobody Told Me. And we have a question for you to think about. Is there something that interferes with your happiness or is preventing you from achieving your goals? BetterHelp Online Counseling is there for you.
BetterHelp allows you to connect with a professional counselor in a safe and private environment. Get help on your own time and at your own pace. You can schedule secure video or phone sessions, plus chat and text with your therapist.
BetterHelp has 3,000 licensed professional counselors in the U.S. who specialize in depression, stress, anxiety, relationships, sleeping, and trauma, anger, family conflicts, LGBT matters, grief, and self-esteem are just some of the issues you might want to discuss.
And of course, anything you share is completely confidential, and if you're not happy with your counselor for any reason, you can request a new one at any time at no additional charge.
BetterHelp is available worldwide, and you can start communicating by text, chat, phone, or video in under 24 hours. Financial aid is available for those who qualify.
It's secure, convenient, and professional. And best of all, it's a truly affordable option. Nobody Told Me listeners get 10% off their first month with discount code NOBODY.
So why not get started today? Go to betterhelp.com/nobody. Simply fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your needs and get matched with a counselor you'll love.
That's betterhelp.com/nobody. One of the lessons that I had a really, really hard time, and I found myself resisting, was that we always have time for what matters to us. And I just thought to myself when I first read it, I thought, no, that's not true. I feel like I'm busy with work and I try and make time for, I'm sure is the reaction that most people have. So what do you find that we're doing wrong?
Well, I think that it's really a matter of mindset. And I'm not saying that you can in any given 24 hours or even 168 hours fit in everything. I mean, I think you can fit in a lot, but probably not absolutely everything that you might want to do in life. But that said, if we walk around with the story that I have all the time in the world, that's a phrase that Juliet, who's the mentor figure in Juliet's School of Possibilities, keeps repeating. I have all the time in the world. It may not be true, but you're better off with that story, because when you have that story, then you start to see possibilities. Instead of being like, oh, I've got to respond to everything instantly, you're like, well, I do have time to read a book. I do have time to have a real conversation with this employee who really wants to talk with me, or a friend who really wants to talk with me. I do have time to, go for a walk and try to get ideas. And when we have that story in our brains and are telling ourselves that, we look for the evidence to support it. Whereas if you walk around with the story that I'm so busy, I have no time for anything, then you start to look for evidence to support that.
And in your book, Juliet's School of Possibilities, you advise people to carve out some quiet time and picture themselves in the future. And I'm wondering why it's important to find quiet time to do that, and why this is an important exercise in the first place.
Well, I think we really get our best ideas when we are letting our minds just roam. The problem is we spend so much of time in reactive mode. And if somebody sends you a note, you respond. You are, looking at something online, reading an article, reading the comments. And it's very entertaining, but it doesn't give our brains a whole lot of time to just come up with ideas. And so what I try to do is go for runs. If I am really stumped on something I'm writing, on a problem I have, I'll just go for a run, put on my running clothes and go for a run. And I work from a home office, so I can do that. I'm not sure if it would work so well for, people are just like, wait, I'm going to run out of this meeting right now and get my running clothes on.
Who wouldn't want to do that, though?
Yeah.
Well, you could. I mean, if you come back with a brilliant idea, maybe people will think it was worth it. And I would, if you are a manager, I'd encourage you to let people do stuff like that, or at least go for walks during the day. We have this faulty notion that putting yourself in front of your computer, never taking a break, is somehow very productive. It tends not to be. But yeah, if you just let your mind roam, it often roams into interesting places. And this Riley character in the book, in fact, gets her career-saving idea while she is biking down the boardwalk. And it's the first time she has not been looking at her phone in a while. And when she puts it away, it turns out she gets ideas that are the reason people are emailing her in the first place.
Do you think we should be planning in rest time or quiet time or time to go on a bike ride or a run throughout the day?
I think we should. And I know that sounds a little crazy to plan in your free time and plan in your leisure time. And some people probably think that defeats the whole purpose. But the truth is, if you have a busy life, you're not going to just magically find time to go for a bike ride. You have to decide that is what you want to do and deal with the logistics in your life that will make it happen, whether, it's trading off with your partner for on childcare duties or, arranging your work schedule so you could come in a little later one day and use the early morning for a bike ride. But you have to plan it into your life, and then you notice that it's happening. And when you start to see yourself, the kind of person who has the space to do these things, it changes your entire perspective on your time.
You also advise picturing yourself over the shorter term, over the next calendar year. Take us through that exercise.
Yeah, so the long-term picture is certainly exciting to think about, where will I be in 10 years, 20 years, whatever. But, given that so much of that is unknowable, I think it helps to dial it down a little bit into something we can actually work with. So I encourage people to do two exercises. One is to sort of think of yourself professionally at the end of the next calendar year, and consider giving yourself a performance review. So if, everyone does this in different organizations at the end of the year, they look back over their successes and opportunities for growth or whatever their euphemism is, and you say what you did in the year. But you could do this looking forward. So picture yourself at the end of the calendar year and say that you're giving yourself a performance review, and it's been an absolutely amazing year for you professionally. If that were to be the case, what 3 to 5 things would you have done that made it so amazing? And when you know those things, now, not the end of the calendar year, you can decide, well, those are my top priorities for the year, right? I want to make that performance review come true by December. So what do I need to do to make that performance review come true by December? And the same thing with your personal life. I mean, you could picture yourself at a holiday party at the end of the year, telling everyone what you did in your personal life in the course of the year. And if it were an amazing year, then what would you have done? What would you be telling people at the punch bowl about your year? And if you have that picture in mind, well, then you've got time before the end of the year to make those things come to be.
And I think a really good way to make it more manageable is to create a time journal, which you talk about in the book. How do we do this?
So I have been tracking my time for about 4 years now. I'm still doing it since the last time I came on this show. People may have thought I was crazy then, but I've stayed crazy and kept with it. Because it's so interesting for me, at least. I love to be accountable for my time. And I know some people who do this with spending. For instance, they know everything they've spent for the past 6 years or something. And so it's basically the same thing with time. So I track my time on a weekly spreadsheet that is half-hour blocks, so 336 blocks representing the 168-hour week. And it's, got days of the week across the top, Monday through Sunday, half-hour blocks down the left-hand side, 5 a.m. to 4:30 a.m. And I just write down what I'm doing as often as I remember, as much detail as I think is going to be helpful. And, so it's a lot of stuff: sleep, work, drive somewhere, hang out with kids, eat dinner, clean up, clean kitchen, just entries like that. And as a result, I know where my time goes. And I think this is very helpful for other people, too, because if we don't know where our time is going, it's really hard to make choices based on good data. Because maybe something we thought was a problem really isn't, or maybe something we've never even considered is taking far more time than we might have imagined. And so people talk themselves into all sorts of false choices like, if I'm going to write that book, I need to quit my job. Well, I mean, that's one idea. But if you look at this and see, I have no idea what I'm doing from 7 to 11 p.m. every night, or my whole weekend disappears into errands that probably could be better thought through. Well, maybe you could find the time there. I mean, maybe you don't have to quit your job yet. Maybe there's some other time that might be available.
And since you came on the last time, I got a productivity journal, which I found is super, super easy. It was simpler for me than mapping out my time every half hour throughout the day. And I just think of 3 things that I definitely need to get done at the first part of the day, and then what comes after that. And I think for our listeners, that might be helpful as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Certainly, planning your days ahead of time and not necessarily planning every minute because stuff comes up, but just asking yourself, well, what are the 3 things that absolutely has to happen tomorrow? And, when can I do those things in the course of my day? And hopefully doing as much of it toward the beginning of the day as possible means that they'll get done. And maybe nothing else gets done. Maybe the entire day falls apart. But if those 3 things do get done, it still feels like a pretty good day.
But you know what? When you end up writing them down, this is really weird. I found when I write them down, sometimes they're different than what I thought they were.
Ooh, interesting. Well, that's good to know. Productivity is all about self-knowledge and learning these things. And sometimes the things that we think are important, if we really drill down to it, aren't. And maybe there's things that deserve space in our life that we haven't necessarily been focusing on. So it's good to ask these questions.
Laura, a few years ago, you wrote a book called I Know How She Does It, How Successful Women Make the Most of Their Time. And I'm wondering, How do time management challenges differ for women versus men?
Well, on some level, they don't, because we all have 24 hours in a day, 168 hours in a week. And so everybody is trying to build their lives within the constructs of this time, men and women alike. That said, I think there are certain cultural narratives that women are still dealing with that men aren't. One of those is that a lot of women grow up with the story that time spent in a professional capacity, so work time, is somehow taking away from their families, right? Whereas I think a lot of men have the story that working is how I contribute to my family, right? That this is something I am doing for my family. Mm-hmm. And so for women, it becomes a source of conflict in a way that just isn't in the male mindset based on this sort of traditional construct. Now, I think this is changing, and one of the issues then is because so many men have grown up with this story that, like, work is the only way I contribute to my family, or is the primary way I contribute to my family. Then when they do have families and find out that they really actually would like to spend a lot of time with them too, they don't have the same culturally acceptable outs that women do. When a new mom says, well, actually, I'd like to come back to work part-time, everyone's like, oh, yes, of course. That's what moms do. We're prepared for that. If a new father comes back and says, I want to work part-time, people are like, what? Like, are you crazy? They get a ton of pushback. They get a lot of, skepticism. People think they're not the real deal anymore. Clearly, they have no ambition. Like, they probably shouldn't even be considered for leadership. It's just all these things. So I think that a lot of men just don't avail themselves of those options, and then they wind up with a lot of work and life stress.
We're glad you could join us on Nobody Told Me, and we wanted to let you know more about one of our sponsors, Molecule, the only air purifier that actually destroys pollutants.
Molecule introduces a breakthrough science that's finally capable of destroying air pollutants at a molecular level.
Molecule's Pico technology not only captures, but completely destroys the full spectrum of indoor air pollutants, including those 1,000 times smaller than a HEPA filter can trap.
Molecule's technology has been personally effective and verified by science, but most importantly, it's been tested by real people.
Molecule has already helped allergy and asthma sufferers around the country better cope with their conditions and significantly reduce their symptoms.
One customer even said that she was able to breathe through her nose for the first time in 15 years.
And we have a special offer for our listeners. For $75 off your first order, visit molecule.com. Now that's Molecule, MOLEKULE.com. And at checkout, enter Nobody Told Me.
Again, that's MOLEKULE.com and enter Nobody Told Me at checkout. Laura, I had so many favorite things that I loved in Juliet's School of Possibilities, but I think the concept of the flooded basement resonated with me the most. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so, Juliet is this very successful business owner, mother, who runs this School of Possibilities where Riley has come for the weekend to learn her ways. And one of the things she tells Riley is about her own story, that, years ago she was running a hotel, was a single mom, newly escaped from poverty. So it was like a great opportunity to be running this hotel. But she really wanted to start this business too. And so she was, how am I going to start this business? I have no time. I'm doing this job. I have to do a good job. I have these two small kids. I have no time. And then the housekeeper at the hotel points out something, which is that, she keeps saying she has no time, and yet the week before, the basement flooded, and she had spent many, many hours dealing with that. And where did that time come from? If the basement hadn't flooded, she still would have said she was busy with something else, but when something really urgent happened, she chucked that something else because it turned out it really wasn't, the most important thing at all. And, and so her point was that, well, you could have chucked those things without the basement flooding, right? You
right.
Decide that starting this business is the equivalent of a flooded basement, and you absolutely have to carve out time for it this week, no matter what. Everything else will fit in around it. And, when we tell ourselves that this is absolutely our top priority, we somehow make it happen. And so Juliet does find time to make it happen, and her amazing business is the result.
What advice do you have to give us for better estimating the amount of time it will take to do any given task that is on our schedule for the day or for the week?
So some of this is just knowledge accrued over time. Although it's pretty funny the number of people who don't let this knowledge accrue. Is that they've made the same drive 100 times and yet persist in thinking it takes 15 minutes, even though it has never taken 15 minutes. Or you've written 100 reports and yet in your mind you have no idea how long it takes to write a report. This is just silly. I mean, this is partly paying attention to our life, and it's one reason to track time, because then you can start to say, oh yeah, it takes me about 2 hours to write a proposal for, an existing client. It takes me 6 hours to write a proposal for a new client. Okay, good to know, right? Because then you know how much of that you can fit in any given day. In general, we are better off overestimating a bit, because then if you get it done early, awesome. You've got free time or time you can go find something else to do. I'm sure you've got many things on your list you can find to do, but by making sure you have enough time blocked out for these things, then you won't fall behind. If you don't know, if it's not something you've done before, there is probably some other human who has done it, so you can ask around. Ask friends, family, colleagues how long they think it will take. Look for ranges, or just, break it down into constituent parts and make an estimate for each of those constituent parts. So you may not know the whole thing, but I'm going to need to reach out to 10 people, so probably it's going to take me a few minutes to find each of these contact information, like 10 minutes to write an email, and then probably the next day half of those people will have gotten back, and it'll take me this amount of time to process it, this amount of time to write it. That's how you do it. You break it down into steps.
What have you found that people like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg are doing with their time that someone like me isn't doing with those same 168 hours?
Well, I mean, the thing with people like that is that they tend to be very clear on the value of their time, but then their whole enterprise is set up to honor that. I don't know, not to go too much into Jeff Bezos, but you may remember he posted that post on Medium about how he wasn't going to answer the National Enquirer's question.
Yeah.
One of the things he said in there is that he had hired the private investigator and said, given him a budget with the goal of protecting my time. I'm like, well, of course, he's willing to spend money, say, do what you want, and I'm going to protect my time. Like, come to me when you have an answer, but you don't need to come to me until that point. And then, so people like that, Bill Gates obviously has meetings, like everyone else, he has meetings, but his meetings are not going to have somebody suddenly go off on a tangent on office fridge policies. Like, everything is very focused on, what he specifically needs to weigh in on. And not on all this extraneous stuff. People prepare days to come have a meeting with him, right? And so the rest of us don't have that same apparatus. However, I do think all of us can feel a little bit more like time is valuable, because we often make mistakes that show we don't think it is. Something like inviting 3 extra people to a meeting who didn't really need to be there. Well, why? I mean, was it just, you're trying to be nice? But it's not like the popular kids table at the cafeteria. I mean, it's like there are people who need to be there. There are people who don't need to be there. Having extra people there just makes it take more time.
Right.
It's less efficient, and it wastes those people's time. So, think about that and view time with a little bit more of a value to it.
What advice do you have if you're in a situation where someone is sort of taking up your time, if they are extending a conversation longer than it needs to be, for example, and you really need to move on to something else?
So in that case, if you have chosen to move on to something else, that there is something else you would like to be doing then with your time, and you think would be the best thing to do with your time, you can simply say, something polite like, this is fascinating. I'd love to follow up with you later. I need to get going to this now. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's simple enough, right? You don't need to go into a whole explanation. That said, if you're having a great conversation with somebody that's really going somewhere very important, I would challenge that you do have to race off to something. Maybe you don't, right? Maybe what you are doing right then is, in fact, the most important thing you can be doing. And I'm not saying you should let a conference room full of people wait for you while you're having this conversation, but one of the reasons to schedule a lot of open space into your life is so that you can stick with stuff that's really good. You can kind of linger in these good conversations and see where they lead.
Yeah, and kind of reassess what you're doing with your day.
Yeah. I mean, maybe this is such a great idea. You want to spend the rest of the day pursuing it.
How do you suggest that people read Juliet's School of Possibilities and get the most out of it?
Well, I mean, it's a novel, so you can read it as such. I hope it's entertaining enough that people want to read it as such. I certainly tried to make a plot that I think could be a plot on its own. But as you're going through it, see if there are, lines that do resonate with you. I mean, you mentioned that one about expectations are infinite, time is finite. You are always choosing, choose well. I mean, that might be something you would underline, or we always have time for what matters to us, or I have all the time in the world. Just these things that stick out to you, and you can think about them as you're reading the story, and maybe at the end, then you sit and go through and say, well, do I believe this? Do I think this is helpful for my own life? And maybe do that exercise of picturing yourself in the future and, picturing how you can do things in the next year or so that would make that come to be.
Laura, you know from being on with us before that we always ask, what's your nobody told me lesson? You've given us one before. You've got another one for us?
Yeah, well, nobody told me that you can write a novel about time management. I love fiction. I read a lot of fiction. And in my mind, I'd sort of made my, career in nonfiction, and that was the way I was going. And if I was going to write fiction, it was only going to be on the side and for fun, and, it wasn't certainly going to be my main thing. And then this opportunity kind of came to me that my publisher noted that they were looking to do a few more parable, fable type books, and was I interested in writing one? And I certainly was. And so I came up with this story and wrote it and had a ton of fun doing it. But it was just a great lesson to me that sometimes you actually don't have to choose, that you can do both, in this case, fiction and nonfiction, while still having the same, personal brand. And that was kind of exciting to learn.
Yeah, and I read so many self-help books for the show. My mom and I do. And I guess I'm so used to the format in which I read them, and I kind of jump around. And so this book, when I first got it, I thought, it's interesting to think about reading a book cover to cover. But it actually was a lot more digestible that way. And the book is small enough that I read it in 2 sittings. And I just think it was great. It kind of threw what I thought about fiction books on its head. So I love it.
Well, I'm happy to hear that, and I'm glad that you felt reading it through completely was a good use of your time. That means a lot to me.
Yeah, and it didn't take a big time commitment too. It's easily digestible.
Yeah, the perfect book on time management because you don't waste too much time reading it, but you get a lot out of it.
That's good. Short is always good.
Laura, how can people connect with you online?
Yeah, well, I hope people will come visit my website, LauraVanderkam.com. I blog there a couple times a week, so always new content there. People can listen to my podcast, Best of Both Worlds. I also have a new one coming out. It's called Before Breakfast. It's starting, and, I always love to hear from people, so hopefully people will look me up.
All right. Well, we thank you so much for joining us again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Our thanks to our guest, Laura Vanderkam. Again, her latest book is called Juliet's School of Possibilities, a little story about the power of priorities. And again, her website is lauravanderkam.com. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens.
You're listening to Nobody Told Me. Thank you so much for joining us.